the cold winter of 1938, as Francisco Franco's armies pushed across the Asturian mountains of Spain, an American war reporter named Thomas McKinnon uncovered something that would shadow him for the rest of his life. Hidden deep within a secluded valley close to the village of Pays, he found the remnants of what survivors whispered to be Spain's most cursed family line. 3 sisters, Elena, Magdalena, and Esperanza Calderón, not only lived beneath the same roof, but also shared one husband, creating what physicians later described as the most genetically isolated lineage in European records. For over 8 decades, McKinnon's locked reports have stayed buried within the State Department archives in Washington, D.C., alongside testimony too horrific for the public eye. What unfolded in that forgotten corner of Asturias between 1895 and 1938 overturns everything we thought we knew about survival and the terrifying extremes families will embrace to defend what they believed was their sacred bloodline. Before we go deeper into the tale of the Calderón sisters and the dreadful discovery that forever altered one American journalist's fate, if you are fascinated by hidden historical mysteries like this, subscribe to our channel and strike that notification bell. We reveal chilling, long-buried accounts from across the globe that strangely tie back to American history, and share in the comments which state you are listening from. We love hearing from our community of truth seekers who help resurrect these forgotten narratives, especially those of Spanish or European descent, who may recognize traces of these old-world secrets. The eastern Asturian mountains were always places where the outside world seemed to look away. Even as Spain destroyed itself in the bloody civil war of 1936 to 1939, the remote valleys near the Picos de Europa remained mostly untouched by the violence raging across the land. It was here, in the lonely hamlet of Pang, that the Calderón family kept their home for nearly 3 centuries, first arriving from the Basque country during the 1640s as herders and stoneworkers. By 1895, the lineage had shrunk to a single man, Don Aurelio Calderón, and his 3 daughters, Elena, the oldest at 22, Magdalena, 20, and Esperanza, just 18. Their mother, Compción, died giving birth to what would have been a 4th daughter, leaving Aurelio to raise the girls in total isolation from the handful of families scattered throughout the valley. The closest town of note was Cangas de Onís, a full day's trek by mule through hazardous mountain trails made impassable during harsh winters. Aurelio Calderón was consumed with what he called blood purity, la pureza de sangre. He spent years poring over genealogies kept in his father's oak chest, tracing the Calderón line through carefully preserved records of births and marriages. What he uncovered left him filled with pride and dread. His family had stayed remarkably untouched by what he saw as foreign taint. No marriages with Moors during the Middle Ages, no ties with conversos, Jewish converts to Christianity, and most crucially, no mingling with the Asturian peasants he judged racially lesser. Yet this left him trapped. As the final male of the Calderón blood, Aurelio faced an impossible dilemma. If he allowed his daughters to marry outsiders, the bloodline he worshipped would be diluted forever. If he denied them husbands entirely, the lineage would vanish with him. There was, however, a darker path, one that had begun to take shape in his troubled mind during the endless winters when the family was cut off from the world. The 3 Calderón daughters had been raised to believe they were unlike anyone else. Their father filled their minds with tales of noble descent, insisting they sprang from Gothic kings, their blood carrying rare powers that had to be preserved. Elena, sharp-featured with piercing grey eyes, became her father's closest ally in his genealogical obsessions. Magdalena, gentler and more doubtful, often dreamed of life beyond the valley, but was told curiosity revealed weakness. Esperanza, the youngest, was born with a slight limp that her father declared a noble mark of ancient blood, a physical sign, he claimed, found only in the purest lines. Isolation shaped them in ways that would horrify any outsider. By 1895, the sisters spoke a dialect nearly unintelligible to other Spaniards, blending archaic Castilian with Asturian, and fragments that seemed medieval Latin. They wore garments decades out of style, sewn by hand from patterns passed down generations. Most unsettling of all, their bond with each other and their father blurred the usual limits of family life had been broken. As the winter of 1895 closed in, Aurelio Calderón made a choice that would echo for decades and eventually reach the ears of an American reporter 40 years later. He summoned his daughters into the main hall of their stone farmhouse and declared what he called a holy responsibility. He had discovered, he told them, the perfect answer to preserve their lineage while guaranteeing its continuation. The sisters would all share one husband, a distant relative named Rodrigo Calderón, whom he had located in a settlement near Santander. Rodrigo, he assured them, carried pure Calderón blood, traced through his grandfather back to the very same ancestor they all descended from. What Aurelio withheld from his daughters was the truth. Rodrigo Calderón was not a distant cousin at all. He was Aurelio's own child by his dead sister, making him the girl's half-brother. The deception had been carefully arranged, supported by counterfeit papers Aurelio had spent months constructing. In his twisted reasoning, this union would not only preserve their bloodline, but refine it further, producing children whose genetic heritage would be denser than any in family history. The system he outlined was precise and emotionless in its calculation. Each daughter would spend 1 month as Rodrigo's primary wife, while the other 2 acted as companions and aides. Any children born from these pairings would be raised collectively, their exact parentage hidden to prevent partiality. The sisters would live united, devoted to their sacred mission of creating the purest possible descendants. Elena, ever the beautiful child, accepted immediately. Magdalena voiced doubts, but was swiftly overruled by her father's theological arguments about divine will and family honor. Only Esperanza sensed the true horror of what was being demanded, yet her protests were dismissed as childish hysteria. Within weeks, Rodrigo Calderón arrived from Santander, a hollow-eyed man of 35 who seemed to grasp his role far too well. The winter of 1896 carried with it a silence that swallowed the Calderón Valley. The first snows had come earlier than usual, sealing the family's farmhouse from the outside world until spring. It was during these months of absolute seclusion that the reality of Aurelio's plan began to reveal itself, and what had seemed disturbing became far more sinister. Rodrigo had reached the valley in November, just as the mountain passes turned deadly. He was a man marked by hardship, his features aged beyond his years, his hands scarred with the calluses of lifelong labor. Yet there was something else, an unsettling fire in his dark eyes, and a manner of speaking that hinted he knew far more about the Calderón past than he admitted. The arrangement began exactly as Aurelio had designed. Elena, as the eldest, was granted the first month as Rodrigo's primary wife. The ritual that bound them was conducted by Aurelio himself, blending Catholic practice with what he claimed were ancestral customs, passed down from Gothic forebears. There were no witnesses, no civil records, no tie to the church in Cangas de Onís. It was in every legal sense not a marriage, but a breeding pact disguised as divine obligation. What occurred during that first month would scar the valley for decades. Eleanor, always the most obedient daughter, began to transform in ways Magdalena and Esperanza could not explain. She grew secretive, whispering with Rodrigo in corners, and showing obsession with her father's genealogical charts. She spent hours copying names and dates, drafting complex trees predicting the genetic makeup of her future children. But it was during long nights by the fire in the farmhouse that the deepest horror began to show itself. Rodrigo spoke of his childhood in ways that contradicted Aurelio's tale of his origins. He mentioned places near Pinares no distant cousin should know. He recalled events from the valley's history with a closeness that revealed personal memory. And most unsettling of all, he bore Aurelio's likeness. The same narrow nose, the same cleft chin, the same grey eyes marking Calderón blood. Magdalena was the first to speak her suspicions. During the second month, when she became Rodrigo's chief companion, she asked sharp questions about his family past. Her inquiries were met with evasions, and more disturbingly with violent fury from her father. Aurelio's extreme reaction to any doubt about Rodrigo's background confirmed Magdalena's darkest fears. There was something deeply unnatural about the entire arrangement. Yet it was Esperanza who uncovered the truth. On a February night in 1897, as a violent blizzard kept the family trapped indoors for 3 days, she stumbled upon a hidden bundle of letters beneath her father's mattress. The correspondence, dating back more than 20 years, revealed the full depth of Aurelio's deception and the true identity of the man who was now rotating through marriages with all 3 sisters. The letters were from Aurelio's sister Carmen, who had died in 1862, shortly after delivering an illegitimate son. The father's name was never written, but the dates and details made clear Aurelio himself was responsible. Carmen had died giving birth inside the Calderón farmhouse, and the infant, Rodrigo, was sent away to live with distant relatives in Santander. The boy grew up unaware of his true bloodline, believing himself to be an orphaned cousin of the Calderóns. But the letters revealed something far more horrifying. Aurelio had been writing Rodrigo for over 5 years, slowly disclosing fragments of family history while carefully hiding the truth of their connection. He convinced the young man he was a distant cousin with a duty to help safeguard the family bloodline, never once admitting that preservation meant marrying and impregnating his own half-sisters. The psychological impact of this discovery on Esperanza was immediate and crushing. She confronted her father that same night, demanding an explanation for what she recognized as not only incest, but a form of generational abuse decades in the making. Aurelio's reply was calm, deliberate, and chilling in its reasoning. He insisted that the traditional meanings of family relationships held no weight when dealing with bloodlines as pure and ancient as theirs. The usual taboos, he argued, applied only to ordinary people who had already polluted their genetics through careless unions across centuries. For families like the Calderóns, who had preserved purity for generations, different laws applied. What others might call incest, he labeled refinement. What some might call abuse, he called holy duty. And the results, he claimed, would prove him right. The children born from these unions would carry gifts no common breeding could achieve: intelligence, beauty, and spiritual strength born from the deliberate concentration of superior blood. They would embody, in his words, the perfection God intended before sin brought chaos into nature's order. Esperanza's horror was matched only by her dawning realization that there was no escape. The winter sealed them in completely, and even once spring arrived, where could she flee? She had no money, no ties to the outside world, and no knowledge of survival beyond the valley that had been her entire existence. Worse still, both Eleanor and Magdalena already showed signs of pregnancy, chaining them forever to the nightmare Aurelio had engineered. As the snows began to thaw in March of 1897, Esperanza made a choice that would haunt the Calderóns for 4 decades. Rather than run or fight openly, she would remain and record everything. She began keeping meticulous notes of daily life in the farmhouse, the progression of her sisters' pregnancies, and above all, the subtle changes in behavior and appearance that would surface in the children soon to be born. The first generation of Calderón offspring arrived that autumn of 1897, bringing grim confirmation of Esperanza's worst fears about her father's genetic obsession. Elena delivered twins, a boy and a girl she named Alonso and Compción, while Magdalena gave birth to a single daughter she called Carmen, after the aunt none of them had ever truly known. The births were grueling, with Aurelio forced to act as midwife since no outside medical help could reach them during the early snow season. From the very beginning, the children displayed traits, marking them as unlike any normal offspring. All 3 carried the unmistakable grey eyes of the Calderón line, yet their features betrayed the consequences of concentrated inbreeding. Alfonso's jaw was malformed with a severe underbite that impaired his speech. Compción's fingers were webbed between the joints, an abnormality that suggested developmental defects. Carmen appeared the most normal of the 3, but as she grew it became clear her hearing was gravely impaired, forcing the household to communicate with her through an intricate pattern of hand signals. Yet more unsettling than these physical deformities were the strange behaviors that began to appear as the children began to change. By the age of 3, all 3 showed a strange fixation on family connections, asking questions about lineage and blood that seemed far beyond their years. They ignored games or pastimes typical for children, instead spending hours examining the genealogical charts covering the farmhouse walls. Most disturbingly, they appeared to sense instinctively that they were part of something secret and important, displaying discretion about family matters that was both remarkable and unsettling. Their growth coincided with major shifts in the adult household. By 1900, the original system of rotating marriages had twisted into something even more complex and disturbing. Elena, Magdalena, and Esperanza had each produced additional children, 8 in total by 1905, yet the truth of exact parentage had been deliberately blurred. Rodrigo continued to move between relationships with all 3 sisters, but now the older children had begun joining family planning discussions, offering thoughts on genetic pairings and bloodline preservation that froze Esperanza's heart. The isolation that first made Aurelio's plan possible now became essential for its survival. Discovery by outside authorities would mean certain condemnation. As a result, the children were denied schooling, medical care, and normal social contact. They learned reading and writing through family records, studied mathematics through genealogical calculations, and built their worldview entirely from their grandfather's lectures on purity and superiority. As the century's first decade unfolded, Aurelio's health began failing, bringing with it a desperate urgency to secure the next generation of his program. Alfonso, despite physical deformities, was being groomed to take command as patriarch. His sisters and cousins were assessed for breeding potential through detailed charts projecting genetic traits and likely offspring qualities. The horror lay in how completely the children accepted their fates. Raised to believe traditional family structures were corrupt and inferior, they saw their own twisted system as a higher order of human design. When Alfonso reached puberty in 1910, he expressed excitement for the day he could fulfill his role in the family mission, anticipating relationships with sisters and cousins not as abuse, but as sacred duty. It was during these years that Esperanza began plotting escape. Not for herself, as she knew redemption was impossible, but to save the youngest children who might still be rescued. Her records had grown into a meticulous chronicle of 3 generations of incest, genetic manipulation, and psychological indoctrination, a testimony she hoped one day might serve as evidence. Yet her hopes for outside intervention were tangled in political turmoil, spreading even to their secluded valley. The unrest that would later erupt into civil war was already visible by the late 1910s, with government instability and shrinking oversight in rural regions. Ironically, the chaos unfolding across Spain gave the Calderons even greater protection, allowing their program to continue unchecked. By 1920, the second generation was already reproducing, with Alfonso fathering children through both his sister Compsion and his cousin Carmen. These new offspring bore even more severe abnormalities than their parents, including children born with profound developmental delays and deformities that threatened survival under their primitive conditions. Yet Aurelio, now in his 70s but still mentally sharp, refused to see this as failure. He declared such outcomes necessary stages of purification, insisting weak children were simply the genetic husks to be cast aside before true perfection emerged. The family had also developed complex theological explanations for the high infant death rate haunting their program. Infants who died young were said to be called back by God, their mission fulfilled. Those who lived were believed specially chosen to carry the bloodline forward. This belief system helped the adults rationalize that nearly half of all children born into the family died before reaching maturity, most from genetic complications or the crude medical conditions of their hidden compound. By the mid-1920s, the Calderón family had expanded into nearly 30 members, everyone descended from the 3 sisters and their shared husband. The farmhouse was enlarged repeatedly to house the growing clan, but the core structure of life remained the same: rigid genetic planning, systematic inbreeding, and total isolation. They had created, in essence, their own enclosed society with its own rules, values, and twisted understanding of human relationships emerged that bore no resemblance to ordinary civilization. The fall of 1930 brought changes that would ultimately set the stage for the family's exposure 8 years later. Spain was entering a period of political unrest that would culminate in the Second Republic and eventually civil war. Yet for the Calderons, the immediate issue was far more personal. Aurelio's death at 85 had left them without their founding patriarch and guiding strategist. Alonso, now 33, and marked by the scars of concentrated inbreeding, premature balding, trembling hands, and teeth that had never developed correctly, assumed command of the breeding program. But his limited intellect, shaped by developmental impairment, made him incapable of handling the complex genealogical calculations once used by his grandfather to direct pairings. The burden instead fell to his sister, Compsion, who inherited not only Aurelio's fixation with purity, but also his old intelligence and ruthless practicality. Under her direction, the family's methods grew even more systematic and terrifying. She created what she called breeding timetables, deciding which relatives would reproduce and with whom, based on detailed records of prior offspring and unexplored genetic combinations. She also began regular evaluations of all members, measuring bodies, testing minds, and cataloging what she called bloodline indicators to refine future pairings. The third generation of Calderons, now numbering over 20, bore the accumulated toll of 4 decades of intentional inbreeding. Deformities had grown so widespread that the family developed methods for handling children with cleft palates, clubfoot, and varying skeletal malformations. Mental challenges spanned from mild delays to extreme impairments that left some entirely dependent. Yet such outcomes were still seen as acceptable losses in pursuit of perfection. More disturbing than the physical and mental effects, however, was the conditioning that shaped this generation's concept of normal relationships. From birth, they were taught to see siblings, cousins, aunts and uncles as potential partners, showing no natural sense of taboo. They discussed family planning casually, assessed their relatives' qualities with clinical detachment, and embraced their roles in the program with eagerness that would have horrified any outsider. Isolation also produced cultural shifts that set them apart from broader Spanish society. Their speech evolved into a dialect blending technical genetic terms with archaic religious language, incomprehensible to outsiders. Their clothes, still handmade in patterns from the 1890s, marked them as relics of an earlier time. Most strikingly, their concept of history, time, and the outside world was frozen at the era of their origin, turning them into living anachronisms in a modernizing nation. During this period, Esperanza, now 53, and showing the premature aging common among breeding women, made a decision that would ultimate ensure discovery. For decades, she had documented the family's life in journals hidden around the compound, but she realized the records would mean nothing unless they reached outside authorities. The challenge was how to make contact without destroying the family she had helped build and sustain. Her solution was ingenious, yet desperate. She began planting carefully phrased notes where they might be found by occasional wanderers, hunters, surveyors, or merchants traveling between Cangaston and Santander. Written in standard Spanish instead of the family's dialect, they included just enough detail to spark curiosity without disclosing the full scope of their practices. These notes described a mysterious mountain community that had preserved ancient Spanish customs and might interest scholars studying old traditions. They included general directions to the compound and hinted that visitors would be welcomed if they approached with respect for traditional life. Esperanza hoped eventually these writings would reach someone with the authority and awareness to intervene. Her plan might have succeeded, but Spain's political turmoil advanced too quickly for her efforts. The Second Republic, declared in 1931, brought increasing division that crippled administration. Even in accessible regions, and especially in remote valleys like the Calderons, oversight disappeared as officials focused on national crises. The eruption of civil war in July 1936 destroyed any chance that Esperanza's messages would be taken seriously by authorities. Spain was tearing itself apart in a struggle that set fascists against republicans, conservatives against revolutionaries, Catholics against secularists. The secluded valleys of eastern Asturias turned into shelters for deserters, havens for fugitives, and lawless zones where ordinary enforcement no longer operated. For the Calderons, the civil war meant both opportunity and risk. The collapse of government oversight allowed them to continue their practices without fear of official intrusion, yet it also drew armed groups and desperate wanderers into their once secure domain. By 1937, they encountered soldiers, refugees, and bandits more frequently, forcing them to craft strategies for handling outsiders while guarding their secrets. Their reaction revealed the depth of their psychological transformation. Instead of seeing the war as a chance to escape isolation, they treated it as proof of their society's superiority. The violence and chaos beyond, they believed, showed that ordinary human bonds were inherently corrupt and destructive. Their own carefully designed breeding program, in contrast, had built a community grounded in genetic strength and social order. This interpretation let them justify harsher measures to safeguard their seclusion. Relatives who expressed curiosity about the outside were forced into re-education meant to reinforce loyalty to bloodline purity. Children desiring to leave were locked within the compound until they displayed full devotion to family goals. Worst of all, outsiders who stumbled upon them were either absorbed into their system or silenced as threats to their mission. The winter of 1937 to 1938 brought a series of events that would eventually lead to the discovery that altered Thomas McKinnon's life forever. The Civil War was entering its closing stage, with Franco's nationalists gaining ground across northern Spain. Asturias, still a Republican stronghold, faced the brutal repression that would define Franco's early rule. State forces carried out sweeping searches of remote zones, hunting for fugitives, weapons stashes, and resistance networks. During one such search, a unit of Guardia Civil first encountered signs of the Calderón family. In December 1937, a patrol investigating reports of activity in Pine Valley uncovered one of Esperanza's notes inside the ruins of a shepherd's hut. Written in her neat hand, it described a traditional Spanish settlement that had preserved pure bloodlines for generations, inviting proper authorities to visit their ancestral home. The commander, Sergeant Miguel Reteria, initially dismissed it as a hermit's fantasy or the ramblings of a refugee, yet something about the careful phrasing and specific geographic details convinced him it deserved attention. More importantly, the valley mentioned was the perfect kind of refuge where Republican fighters might conceal themselves or hide supplies. The patrol's approach to the Calderón homestead in January 1938 began a confrontation decades in the making. The family, now 43 strong from infants to elders, had designed elaborate rules for managing intrusions. These methods, refined through wartime encounters, relied on misdirection, intimidation, and when needed, silencing witnesses. The Guardia's first sight of the compound was unsettling. Stone dwellings frozen in another century, occupied by people dressed in outdated garments, speaking a dialect barely recognizable as Spanish. Yet as Sergeant Reteria and his men probed deeper, they uncovered evidence beyond comprehension. The genealogical charts covering every wall revealed a pattern of pairings that amounted to systematic incest lasting generations. Records carefully preserved by Aurelio and later Compton tracked dozens of children whose lineage defied every social and religious law in Spain. Most chilling, the family themselves discussed their breeding practices openly, not as disgraceful secrets, but as achievements to be admired. Sergeant Reteria, a hardened officer who had endured the worst atrocities of civil war, now confronted something that shook his understanding of humanity itself. This was not crude abuse occasionally found in remote villages, but an organized multi-generational experiment in genetic control executed with scientific precision and religious zeal. The Confro, Ontation might have ended with arrests and the children placed under state care, but circumstances shifted due to the presence of an unexpected figure among the Guardia Civil Patrol. Thomas McKinnon, the American correspondent, who would later compose the sealed reports documenting the full breadth of the Calderón family's practices, had been traveling with the patrol during his coverage of the war's final chapter. McKinnon, a 28-year-old reporter working for several American papers, had sought approval to observe military maneuvers in rural Asturias as background for stories about the war's effect on traditional Spanish culture. He was especially drawn to how remote villages were impacted by the conflict, making him the perfect witness to the uncovering of a family that had stayed completely untouched by outside forces for more than 40 years. McKinnon's presence shifted the nature of the encounter in critical ways. As an American civilian without any direct role in Spain's political struggles, he approached the situation with an objectivity impossible for Spanish officials. More importantly, his experience as a journalist prepared him to record evidence and safeguard testimony in ways that became invaluable for understanding the entire scope of what occurred in Calderón Valley. The American correspondent's first reaction to the family was a mix of intrigue and revulsion that would shape his reporting for decades after. He understood instantly that he was witnessing something without precedent in modern European history. A society deliberately cut off from ordinary human civilization in pursuit of genetic ambitions that bordered on scientific fantasy. Yet McKinnon also realized that the timing of the discovery created severe obstacles for any official response. Spain was locked in a merciless civil war that had already taken hundreds of thousands of lives and displaced millions more. The emerging Franco regime was consumed with consolidating power and crushing republican resistance. The last issue Spanish authorities wanted was a scandal involving systematic incest in a hidden mountain enclave. The arrangement reached by Sergeant Rateria and McKinnon reflected the practical realities of wartime rule. The Calderón family would be quietly separated into institutions where the children might gain real care and schooling, while the adults faced prosecution for their crimes. The case would be managed discreetly to avoid publicity that could shame the new government or hand propaganda to Republican enemies. McKinnon's role in this plan was decisive. As an American journalist with global contacts, he could guarantee that the case received proper documentation and that the children's welfare remained protected during the transition. In return, he agreed to postpone publishing his findings until Spanish officials finished their inquiry and reached resolution. What none foresaw was that this short delay in publication would stretch across decades, turning into permanent silence that left the Calderón family's tale buried in classified files until long after every participant was gone. Just when it seemed we had seen everything, the terror in Payne's Valley deepened. If this story chills you, share this video with a friend who thrives on dark mysteries. Smash that like button to support our channel, and subscribe so you never miss more stories like this. Now, let's uncover what comes next in this saga of Europe's most secluded bloodline. The entire scale of the Calderón family's experiments came to light during a week-long probe in February 1938, which McKinnon would later call descending into a waking nightmare that shattered everything I thought I knew about civilization. Working beside Spanish medical officials who had been secretly summoned to assess the case, the American correspondent collected evidence of structured breeding practices that produced results both older and more shocking than anyone first imagined. The medical evaluations of family members exposed consistent patterns of genetic disorders that illustrated the consequences of intense inbreeding. Dr. Carlos Mendizabal, a geneticist from Salamanca University, sworn to secrecy about the case, concluded that the Calderón bloodline represented the most genetically isolated human group in documented history, with levels of homozygosity beyond anything recorded in scientific work. The physical results of this genetic narrowing were visible throughout the family. Nearly every individual bore some form of abnormality, from relatively minor conditions such as odd dental growths and skeletal deformities, to devastating issues including profound mental retardation, congenital deafness, and multiple organ malformations. Infant mortality had reached nearly 60%, with most deaths within the first year caused by genetic complications. Yet the physical deformities, gruesome as they appeared, paled compared with the psychological toll of the family's breeding system on those who survived. The children and young adults who grew to maturity inside the compound lacked any trace of normal social development. They were raised to view brothers, parents, and cousins only through the perspective of genetic usefulness, judging kinship purely by breeding outcomes instead of emotional ties. McKinnon's interviews with them revealed the overwhelming extent of their psychological training. Concepcion, now the family's central leader, spoke with cold detachment about her duty in pairing mates and supervising pregnancy results. She maintained precise records, not only of genetic unions, but also of performance rankings for members, scoring their contributions to the improvement of the line with numerical scores that defined their position within the family hierarchy. The children, spanning ages from newborns to young adults, displayed levels of indoctrination McKinnon found nearly beyond comprehension. They spoke casually about predetermined roles in future breeding timetables, judged their siblings as potential partners with scientific detachment, and expressed genuine excitement for their participation in what they were taught to see as a sacred mission of genetic purification. Most unsettling of all was the revelation of Esperanza's concealed journals, which offered a day-by-day chronicle of the family's evolution over 4 decades. Her carefully preserved records detailed not only the breeding choices and their outcomes, but also the psychological techniques employed to sustain family unity and suppress rebellion against the system. The writings showed that several members had indeed attempted escape through the years, but they were systematically pursued, subjected to brutal correction procedures, and either forced back into compliance or erased as dangers to family safety. These escape attempts had triggered the creation of increasingly advanced control structures. Members were forbidden from traveling alone outside the immediate compound. Children endured regular loyalty tests meant to expose dissidents before they could act on rebellious thoughts. Most effectively, the family designed an intricate system of mutual surveillance, obligating members to report any hint of disloyalty or desire to leave the enclave. Such measures were justified through a layered ideological framework, blending distorted Catholic theology with pseudo-scientific claims about genetic superiority. Members were taught they were serving God's mission to purify mankind, and that any betrayal of this work meant not only personal damnation, but also corruption of the entire species. This religious rationale rendered opposition nearly impossible for anyone raised within its boundaries. The investigation also uncovered the family's complete separation from ordinary Spanish society. They had created a currency system based on genetic contributions rather than money. Their calendar revolved around breeding cycles rather than civil or religious festivals. Most strikingly, they developed their own judiciary, with Concepcion acting as judge, jury, and executioner in cases concerning family genetic law. McKinnon's most chilling revelation came when he examined the family's plans for growth. Rather than being content with their current numbers, the leadership devised elaborate strategies to draw in fresh genetic stock from outsiders. They had identified other secluded families nearby, considered suitable for absorption into their program, and had started approaching these targets through carefully prepared deception. The recruitment method relied on contacting isolated families during times of crisis, death, poverty, or political persecution, offering aid in return for marriage alliances. Young adults from targeted households were invited into the Calderón compound as spouses, but were not told the truth about the community until after they were physically and psychologically entrapped within the system. Several such efforts had already succeeded. McKinnon uncovered evidence that at least 6 outsiders had been absorbed into the Calderón program over the last 10 years. These recruits were cut off from their birth families, subjected to relentless indoctrination, and eventually inserted into the breeding plan as though they had always belonged. The fate of those who resisted assimilation was recorded in Esperanza's journals with chilling precision. Individuals refusing to participate in breeding were subjected to escalating psychological and physical coercion until they either complied or were judged irredeemable. Those in the latter group vanished from the accounts with terse notes stating they had been returned to God or had chosen to seek fortune elsewhere. McKinnon's probe revealed the family had devised efficient methods for disposing of both resistant reeds, cruets, and genetically unfit offspring. A series of unmarked graves in the forest around the compound contained at least 20 victims whose deaths were never reported to officials. The graves were arranged in a deliberate pattern, suggesting steady use across years, proving that eliminating unsuitable individuals had become a routine part of the family's genetic management. The American correspondent's final revelation was perhaps the most disturbing of all, evidence that certain Spanish officials had long known of the family's activities but deliberately ignored them due to remoteness and the chaos of the Civil War era. Local priests received reports of unusual practices but dismissed them as rustic folklore. Government officers were informed of missing persons nearby but attributed the disappearances to war-related violence instead of conducting serious inquiries. This official neglect allowed the family to function with absolute impunity for over 40 years, broadening their genetic program and recruitment schemes while staying almost invisible to the outside world. The 1938 discovery happened not through any systematic investigation of rural enclaves, but purely by accident during a military patrol searching for Republican fugitives. The realization that such extensive criminal activity could persist undiscovered for so long raised profound questions about the proficiency of government oversight in rural Spain and the susceptibility of isolated communities to predatory exploitation. McKinnon acknowledged that the Calderón case was not merely an isolated instance of family dysfunction, but a systematic collapse of social institutions with serious implications for the protection of vulnerable populations across the nation. Dismantling the Calderón compound in March 1938 required a carefully coordinated operation including medical experts, social workers, and security staff, all sworn to absolute confidentiality about the mission. Spanish authorities, already overwhelmed by post-Civil War reconstruction, aimed to handle the case with minimal exposure that might disgrace the new Franco regime or spark international complications. McKinnon watched as 43 individuals were systematically removed from the only world most had ever known and distributed among institutions across northern Spain. The youngest, under age 10, were placed in Catholic orphanages where they could receive education and hopefully overcome the early conditioning's psychological damage. The older children and young adults were sent to specialized facilities, offering medical care for their genetic conditions and intensive rehabilitation to prepare them for eventual integration into mainstream society. The adult family members faced a more complicated destiny. Concepcion and other breeding program leaders were quietly prosecuted for incest, child abuse, kidnapping, and multiple murders. Their trials were held behind closed doors with sealed records to avoid public disclosure of the case. Most received lengthy prison sentences, although several died in custody within a few years due to genetic health issues and the stress of adjusting to life outside their isolated world. Esperanza, whose journals provided vital evidence to explain the family's practices, posed a particular dilemma. Her comprehensive records had enabled the investigation, yet she had been complicit in decades of criminal conduct. The resolution was to grant her immunity from prosecution in return for ongoing assistance with scientists studying the genetic and psychological impact of extreme isolation and inbreeding. Under this agreement, Esperanza spent her remaining years collaborating with Dr. Mendizabal and other researchers attempting to unravel the full implications of the Calderón case. Her insight into the family's psychological conditioning methods and genetic selection practices furnished crucial data, shaping policies on child welfare and the detection of isolated abuse situations. The physical compound itself was thoroughly recorded and then systematically demolished. McKinnon actively participated, photographing each room, cataloging every document, and preserving evidence that would later be filed in Spanish government archives. The genealogical charts covering the walls were precisely copied before being incinerated, creating an enduring record of what Dr. Mendizabal called the most comprehensive documentation of human inbreeding ever compiled. The unmarked graves around the compound were exhumed and their contents meticulously analyzed. 23 individuals were recovered, ranging from infants who died shortly after birth to adults who appeared to have been murdered when attempting escape or resisting breeding mandates. Each set of remains narrated a story of calculated violence required to uphold the family's genetic isolation. The investigation's aftermath took both professional resilience and personal toll from McKinnon. His initial agreement to delay publication while Spanish authorities resolved the case had seemed reasonable, but as months turned into years with no official disclosure, he realized the case would remain forever unpublished. The Franco regime was too invested in projecting traditional Spanish values and social stability to risk the international embarrassment such a revelation would provoke. Multiple attempts by the American correspondent to publish his findings through international media failed, blocked by Spanish government pressure and editors wary of a story too extreme to trust. Editors who considered publishing required multiple corroborating sources and official confirmation, none of which authorities were willing to supply. Frustrated by these barriers, McKinnon eventually submitted his full documentation to the U.S. State Department, hoping future researchers or journalists might access it when political conditions changed. His sealed 1940 report included thousands of pages of testimony, hundreds of photographs, and extensive genealogical documentation presenting a comprehensive record of the Calderón family's 4 decades of genetic experimentation. The surviving family members' fates varied depending on age, health, and psychological adaptability. The youngest, removed before age 5, largely managed to adapt to mainstream society and integrated into Spanish life with few signs of their unusual origins. Several were adopted by families who remained unaware of their background, allowing them to grow up free from the stigma of their genetic heritage. The older children and adolescents encountered greater struggles. Many endured physical impairments requiring continuous medical care, while others showed psychological conditions that rendered social integration challenging or even unattainable. Some spent their lives entirely in institutional care, never truly escaping the conditioning impressed upon them during formative years inside the compound. Perhaps most heartbreakingly, several rescued members proved incapable of adapting to existence in the outside world, repeatedly trying to return to the mountains where their settlement once stood. These individuals had been thoroughly conditioned to perceive their secluded life as superior to normal society, viewing the broader world as disorderly, corrupt, and spiritually degraded. At least 3 former members ended their lives rather than endure what they saw as a foreign and hostile environment. The long-lasting consequences of the Calderón case reached far beyond the immediate destiny of its family members. Dr. Mendizabal's studies on genetic consequences of severe inbreeding fueled significant advances in comprehending hereditary illnesses and the medical outcomes of genetic isolation. His findings further shaped the creation of screening programs intended to identify and support other isolated groups vulnerable to comparable systemic exploitation. On a wider scale, the case revealed the urgent need for stronger oversight of rural populations and greater safeguards for individuals residing in remote regions where traditional social controls could collapse. The Spanish authorities, despite their reluctance to publicize the Calderón affair, implemented new measures requiring regular inspections of secluded villages by social workers and medical experts. McKinnon's sealed report stayed classified for more than 4 decades, finally released to scholars in the 1980s as part of a broader unsealing of Spanish Civil War-era files. Even then, access remained limited to credentialed academics who consented to protect the anonymity of surviving relatives and their descendants. The American reporter himself was deeply transformed by his confrontation with the Calderón clan. He continued his journalistic work for decades, covering conflicts and social crises across Europe and Latin America, but colleagues observed he never again carried the same faith in human nature that had defined his earlier career. In interviews near his life's end, McKinnon described the Calderón ordeal as a window into the darkness dwelling within humanity once all social boundaries collapse and every moral restraint disappears. The concluding chapter of the Calderón saga unfolded in 1983 when Esperanza passed away in a Madrid nursing home aged 96. She had devoted her final 40 years to collaborating with researchers and occasionally meeting journalists who gained access to declassified records until her death. She maintained that the family's breeding initiative, despite its horrific outcomes, had been driven by sincere convictions about genetic progress and human perfection. Her passing closed the living memory of the family's activities, yet the records she helped preserve continued to provide priceless insights for those studying extreme isolation, systematic abuse, and the psychological forces enabling ordinary people to commit extraordinary cruelty. The Calderón story became a standard reference in scholarship on family dysfunction, genetic counseling, and protection of vulnerable populations. Today, the valley where the compound once existed remains mostly deserted. Locals still whisper about the cursed family who lived there, and occasional hikers stumble upon remnants of stone foundations hidden within the forest. The Spanish state has never acknowledged the case publicly, and official archives remain sealed under laws protecting family privacy and state security. Yet the legacy of the Calderón sisters and their shared husband still influences our grasp of human behavior under extreme conditions. Their story reminds us that civilization is fragile, easily corrupted when seclusion and fanatical belief merge into closed systems resistant to scrutiny and moral correction. This dark chapter of Spanish history demonstrates that the most dangerous monsters are not mythical beings from folklore, but ordinary humans persuading themselves their horrific deeds serve some greater cause. The Calderón family believed they were forging genetic perfection, but produced only misery, deformity, and death, a testament to the corrupting force of complete isolation and the human tendency for self-deception in pursuit of distorted ideals. What are your thoughts on this story? Do you believe everything has been uncovered, or might hidden enclaves still exist, chasing their own grim visions of human refinement? Leave your comment below and share your perspective on this haunting tale from the mountains of Asturias. If you enjoyed this dive into one of history's darkest family secrets, subscribe to our channel, click the notification bell, and share this video with someone drawn to the darker mysteries of our past. We'll see you in the next episode as we continue unearthing the buried horrors that shaped our world.